Professor Bosworth. Can we move on now to one aspect of staff recruitment? At your first report at 5.1, just trying to get my fat fingers to find it, page 27. You say, as part of this inquiry into staff culture, I have been asked to comment on the appropriateness of staff recruitment, induction and training, including with regard to detained persons' welfare. While these matters are primarily ones about process, they raise other questions about people's motivation for taking this kind of work, which may be relevant for understanding how they perform their tasks and view their role. And paragraph 5.3, you quote from an advertisement that you saw for the role on page 28. Do you consider that and this is a question G4S have asked me to ask, do you consider the wording in the advert you quote from attracts the wrong or the right type of recruit? I'm not sure if we're being asked to ask you whether G4S could slightly revise their advertisement going forwards, but do you have any view about it?
I mean, I don't know that I really do have a view about the effect of the wording. I mean, the wording includes terms that seem positive, like listener and counsellor, although peacekeeper, I'm slightly less clear about what they're getting at there. I think I mean, this was not the wording of the ad. I don't think that would have been in place when the people were recruited. I couldn't find the wording of the ad in 2017, so I don't know how much has changed. But I guess one of the things that quite a few of the officers say, don't they, is that they didn't necessarily know what they were getting themselves into.
Yeah.
And it's a little unclear whether this wording is particularly transparent about that. I mean, I think the wording seems fine.
Yeah. And at 5.5, under staff training, in the second sentence, many of the training documents I've consulted have been copied from prison staff training packages designed by the National Offender Manager Service, NOMS. And you give examples of that, including mental health, suicide, self-harm. And the question is, are the NOMS training packages well regarded or of a suitable standard within the custodial environment, or do you not know?
I don't know, but I also think that's not really a very relevant question because IRCs are not prisons, and so they shouldn't be using training from a prison.
Thank you. Moving on then to issues of adults at risk. For this we go to your second report, paragraph 2.3 and onwards. At 2.4, you say in the supplementary materials you looked at, there was little mention made of the AAR policy in place during the relevant period. What's your take on, bearing in mind it was all in its infancy during the relevant period, so we have to be slightly mindful of that, but having borne that in mind, did you note a general lack of reference to or awareness of the AAR system within the G4S material?
Well, yes, I think I say in this supplementary report, and I think I also mentioned it in the first one, that the terminology didn't really appear very frequently at all, if at all. I mean, and instead they use other analogous terms. So safer custody is the kind of umbrella term, and so they may well have been speaking about the adults at risk policy then, but it wasn't minuted and it wasn't referred to.
And do you think if there was a lack of awareness of the adults at risk system or policy, that was indicative perhaps of a lack of priority given to the issue of detainee vulnerability and welfare within the contractual relationship between the Home Office and G4S?
I'm not sure that I can really speak to that. I mean, I think it was, the relevant period was in the very early stages of the adults at risk policy implementation, and so I mean, there was obviously a lag in implementing it. Why that lag wasn't caught by the Home Office contract monitors and also by the SMT is a question I can't answer.
All right, well, you will remember this, the Verita report, and let's just put it up briefly, please, CJS 005923 at page 241. And paragraph 1439 at the bottom, the former director told us that the Home Office managers he dealt with during his time running Brook House, so they're talking about Ben Saunders here, up to September 2017, had been primarily concerned with how G4S supported the immigration removal process. And if we go to the next page, please, at the top, 1440, we interviewed the former Home Office contract manager who left at the end of 2017. He appeared to concede that during his time in the role, when there had not been a separate service delivery team, his priority and that of those he reported to had been with delivery of elements of the contract that supported the removals process, such as the requirements that detainees be presented within specified times for meetings with the Home Office and for legal hearings for transfers and removals. And at 1441, the Home Office Service Delivery Manager acknowledged that the Home Office had been more focused on those aspects of the contract with G4S that supported the delivery of immigration objectives. And so this part of the report is very much in the same vein. And if we go to the next page, probably page 244, please. At the top, 1446. We believe they should take greater responsibility than they appear to have done in the past for monitoring the overall experience of detainees at Brook House and whether G4S is providing detainees with enough to occupy their time and are adequately ensuring the overall welfare of detainees. And so the focus of this part of the report and of some of the evidence we've heard is the contract focused far too much on contract delivery and not at all, or very little, on the welfare of detainees. You say, as we saw at 2.9 and 2.11 of your second report, that the official AA policy was in place during the relevant period, but it was unfamiliar and not widely understood. Do you think it's indicative of a disconnect between statements of policy and guidance and the detention services orders and the reality of implementation and practice of such safeguards on the ground?
A short answer to that is it seems to be. A slightly longer answer to that, I think, would be that the Home Office and G4S in this case, I think, have slightly different roles to play, and insofar as the Home Office is there for immigration control and G4S is there for custody. And I think that one of the things that happens with detention centres is that split of responsibility can lead to these sorts of problems. And so the purpose of detention for the Home Office is in fact to facilitate removal, basically. And whereas for G4S, it's to offer a safe and dignified custodial experience. So it's, I think that too often the Home Office is actually separate from these sorts of discussions. And in this case, it does seem to have meant that the adults at risk policy wasn't implemented effectively from the very start.
Do you have a view about whether the mixed detainee population on E-Wing, in other words, the co-location of the vulnerable and the refractory, do you have a view about whether that mixture impacted on the treatment of vulnerable individuals? who were accommodated on E-wing?
Yeah, I'm not sure we should call them refractory, but
Well, that's the term in the rules.
I know. Yes, I mean, I think putting people together who are vulnerable and anxious and mentally unwell with people who are vulnerable and angry, if that's what refractory means, I think that obviously makes it very difficult for both groups, and for the officers who are there to look after them.
What about those who are vulnerable, who are put there, and those who are refractory but not vulnerable? Just difficult and disruptive.
Yeah, I'm not sure why they would put those people in the same space.
Well, we know E-wing was used as a staging post
Yeah.
for removal. Do you have a view about that?
Well, I mean, I think so IRCs are there to facilitate removal, and if you don't move somebody out of a regular housing unit and put them somewhere in preparation for that, then you have to get them out of the housing unit. And one of the other characteristics of IRCs is that what people refer to as arrivals and departures happen 24 hours a day. So you may well be collecting somebody for a deportation flight in the middle of the night. And so clearly that's going to be frightening and disruptive for the person and also for people around that person. So I can see the logic for the centre. I think it's largely administrative convenience. But mixing those people with other people who are mentally unwell, that seems to be a very unwise.
I think we were told that the reason E-wing was used was because it had a door to the outside where the van could come and pick up people who were going to be transferred. Did you realise that?
No, I mean, my understanding of this is that the officers would collect somebody from their room and then they have to take them down to what's called the reception area, and then the escort agents collect them from the reception area. So there is normally a second place where they have to go, whether they come from E-wing or somewhere else.
No. All right. So, but that was your understanding, and unless I've misremembered it, I'm fairly confident that we were told that, if not by Callum Tully, then certainly others.
That they were taken directly to the van?
No, that E-wing was a convenient place to house men who were about to be removed by the escorts, because there was a door to the outside of the building. So it was a convenience as much as anything else. We've heard quite a bit of evidence about the use or misuse of segregation as a means to manage mental illness. Dr. Bingham, by way of example. Do you consider that fits very well with or reflects wider staff attitudes towards the care and management of vulnerable detainees?
I think that custodial institutions quite often still persist in placing vulnerable and self-harming individuals in segregation, and I think there's been a concerted effort for many years to across all different forms of custodial institutions to persuade them to do otherwise. I think that it does suggest a sort of lack of care of the detained individual. It also probably suggests a lack of alternatives and effective ways of helping those people. But it is a bit unclear to me in a place like Brook House, if you have such mentally unwell people, how you would meaningfully care for them in that kind of side of custody.
Do you have any views about whether the ACDT process at Brook House during the period was being run as a prison-based risk management process with little clinical input?
So the ACDT process is based on the ACCT process from prison. So it's another one of these examples of a policy that's just been brought over. So yes.
And do you have a view whether the healthcare's lack of involvement in this is indicative of the Home Office or G4S's prioritisation of effecting immigration control and cost saving?
The lack of healthcare involvement in the ACDT.
Yeah.
I don't really have a view on that because the ACDT process is the system-wide process, so it's not exactly up to G4S. In any case, it's just the form that's used.
Yeah. In the end, do you think Brook House as an environment or as a structure was designed to hold mentally ill people?
No.
And you've already, I think, made clear your view that it wasn't. It was designed to be, I think this is what you said, a short-term holding facility, or at least that's what people say it was designed to be.
Well, I mean, I understand, I think it was Lee Hanford
Yeah.
and somebody else had said that in the original contract, GSL bid for it, saying that they would hold people for 72 hours. I've never understood that because I don't understand why you would build a Category B prison designed to hold some people for 72 hours.
So are you saying if that was the understanding, it can't be right because there's no point in building a Category B prison?
Yes, I mean, and also because Colnbrook, which was already open, was
Yeah.
also a Category B, and it was never designed just for 72 hours. So I know that that's in the evidence, and that this seems to have been written into the original contract, but it doesn't really make much sense.
I've already asked you about aspects of those officers who expressed themselves in terms of mentally ill detainees being attention-seeking or manipulative. Dr. Patterson, if we go back to his statement, please, BHM 000045 at page 21. Chair, it's your bundle, supplementary bundle, tab 6, paragraphs 93 and 94. He speaks of exposure. Of staff to distressed, dysregulated, self-harming, suicidal or violent behaviour, including involvement in restraint, seclusion and compulsory medication, may result in trauma for all those directly involved or vicariously exposed, including staff. And then at 94, he talks about despair and helplessness may turn all too readily into anger, frustration to aggression, and fear into resentment. In extremis, we see the development of malignant alienation, those charged with guarding the welfare of the vulnerable, instead of acting to prevent suicide or self-harm, lost in frustration, rage and hatred, seek instead to inspire it. Did you see any evidence of inspiration of self-harm or attempted suicide in anything that you read or watched?
No, not directly. I mean, I think the only way you could extrapolate that would be to think that the language that was used towards the detained population and the sort of hostility that sometimes was shown in the footage of staff in the offices being very short with people, that could be a sort of muted version of this. But I think what Dr. Patterson here is talking about is he's talking about secondary trauma. This is what I was referring to before, so that the officers are affected by what they see. But no, I don't think they were inspiring people to take their own lives.
Do you think there's any significance in the fact that staff members who were implicated in the culture and the abuse of detainees, Yampashali, for example, worked a lot on E-Wing, were often the very same charged with undertaking ACDT observations for their welfare? Do you think there's a disconnect between the two, or a connection?
Well, I suppose this description by Dr. Patterson would simply be asking us to consider that if these officers are having to deal a lot with highly distressed people, so distressed that they're on a constant watch, that will be affecting the officers themselves. So yes, that seems to me to be plausible.
Another related issue, we heard from Sandra Calver, and when she gave evidence, amongst other things that she said, she was the head of healthcare at the relevant time, that she wasn't confident that clinical staff could identify signs of trauma because they didn't have sufficient training on PTSD. And neither did healthcare receive sufficient training on identifying mental disorder or deterioration. How do you consider this speaks to the culture of Brook House, that even those expressly tasked with safeguarding vulnerable detainees didn't have sufficient training or awareness?
Well, I think it's a matter of grave concern that if they knew that they had people with those needs, that they should have been trained to deal with them.
And do you think it signifies that low priority was afforded to detainee vulnerability within Brook House?
Well, it seems to, yes.
We're going to hear from Philip Riley, who is the corporate witness for the Home Office, and he's going to come and give evidence next Monday. And he made a witness statement. Perhaps we can put this up on screen. HOM 033205. Jay, you should find this behind tab 25 of your supplementary bundle. And can we go to page 16, please? And at paragraph 51 at the bottom, he says, I would defer to the assessment of experts in their assessment of the adults at risk policy's effectiveness. Any assessment of its effectiveness at Brook House during the relevant period will to some degree be stymied by the benefit of hindsight and would need to be cognizant that the policy was in its infancy during that time. I note that the IMB's report for 2017 offered a balanced view on the nascent policy. More recently, in his second report on immigration detention, Stephen Shaw acknowledged the genuine focus on vulnerability that the AAR policy had fostered and commented that it would be folly to abandon it. Clearly, there may be room for improvement in the operation of the adults at risk policy, including at Brook House. The operation of adults at risk is subject to annual inspection by the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration. In responding to the inspector's first review, the then Director General of Immigration Enforcement acknowledged concerns that existed in such areas as clarity of roles, quality of discussion within case progression panels, and overall quality of decision making. An action plan was put in place to address those issues, and he says, I look forward to reading the ICIBI second review, which has now been published, as it was, in October last year. And in that review, I'm going to resist putting it up on screen, but at paragraph 3.3, and for the record it's INQ 000156, at 3.3, the report reads, more broadly, genuine concerns about vulnerability were in tension with a widely held view within the Home Office that the safeguarding mechanisms used to identify and protect vulnerable detainees were and are being abused. And the paragraph goes on, and then at 3.4, progress towards the implementation of the accepted recommendations from the first inspection had been slow and limited. Work to improve conditions for immigration detainees held in prisons had not advanced beyond the scoping stage, and the introduction of a pilot to test an enhanced screening tool for vulnerability, the design of which had attracted criticism from stakeholders, had been suspended as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's more to paragraph 3.4 than that. 4.1, which is the first paragraph under the heading recommendations. Without further delays, implement the recommendations from previous reviews and reports about the adults at risk in immigration detention policy by Stephen Shaw, the ICIBI and other statutory bodies, producing a revised timetable for this work and resourcing it, so that it is completed during 2021 and 2022, or if this is not possible, by a specified later date, and including in this process related recommendations from ICIBI reports concerning non-detained vulnerable adults and reporting and offender management. Does it concern you that even now, several years later, the Home Office is only just putting in place an action plan to address issues following an annual inspection by the ICIBI?
Yes.
I mean, I didn't ask you at the time, but you mentioned the Oakington report. How much of that has been implemented? And that was 2005.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that happens in the policy arena in this field is that we tend to go round and round in circles a bit, and it's not as though, I think there's a lot of repeated calls for things to happen, and they often don't get implemented, which again I think reminds us that while we're here to talk about Brook House and we have to talk about Brook House, it's also, this is in a wider kind of landscape. And I think, there are really significant questions that continue to be asked about whether it's actually possible to safely hold vulnerable adults in detention.
Well, if we go back a few months and look at the IMB's report published in May 2021 in relation to the period 1st of December to the 1st of January to the end of December 2020, and perhaps we can put this one up on screen, IMB 000202. So we put up the first page, we can see the published date and the reporting year, and then please can we go to page 10. And for part of this period, of course, Serco have been in post, G4S having given up the contract in favour of Serco, I think in May 2020. Under 4.2, suicide and self-harm. While Brook House is accustomed to distress among detainees, the substantial number of cases of self-harm and threats of suicide by detainees in the latter part of 2020 has been a major concern for the board and everyone in the centre. And it's clearly illustrated, they say, in the chart below. It then deals with ACDTs being used to monitor the welfare of detainees when there is a concern that they are at risk, typically of suicide or self-harm or from a medical condition. And then below that, statistics from the second half of the year show a strong correlation of increased incidence of ACDTs, acts of self-harm and suicidal ideation with the change in population and the concentrated charter flight programme. Incidence of self-harm increased sharply in August and only reduced in December with the wind down of charter flights and the subsequent release of most detainees. And then over the page, it's the board's view that the significant increase in self-harm and suicide risk is directly linked to the higher level of vulnerability of the small boat population and the intensive programme of Dublin Convention charter flights. The response to serious incidents of self-harm and threats of suicide was often constant supervision by officers to prevent further harm, and there's a reference to the table below. Although reasons are given in this report as to why these incidents of self-harm and threats of suicide were on the increase, nonetheless, do you have concerns that the IMB should be reporting this 4 years after the events that this inquiry is dealing with?
I mean, certainly I have concerns. I think the issues that are evident in this set of examples are probably distinct from the issues that were evident in the relevant period. So, yeah. Because I think that they explain it, I think, very persuasively, that this was about how Brook House was being used for a particular population of asylum seekers, and I think this is, again, it's one of the complexities of IRCs, is that they can be used and deployed in quite different ways for different populations, but the populations, the one thing they have in common, other than their lack of British citizenship, is often a heightened level of vulnerability. So these people who've come across on small boats, they're obviously extremely vulnerable. And all the custodial officers can do is put in place the ACDT policy, because once they're detained, they just have to deal with them. So that's, I'm not quite sure what the question is, because that's the only tool they have, and it's obviously an inadequate tool. But the problem is well before the person gets to detention, that they presumably shouldn't have been putting small boat people off the small boats into detention.
Well, then it comes back to your wider than the remit
Yes.
thesis, which is they shouldn't be in detention in the first place.
Yes.
Yeah. Which brings me to this, because we've heard lots of evidence, and a statement from Professor Katona, which you may have looked at, also says that IRCs are not an appropriate therapeutic setting to accommodate vulnerable detainees due to the nature of the IRC environment and the lack of specialist mental health resources, with which presumably you agree.
That's right.
At 6.9 of your first report, on page 32, you say in the second sentence, G4S has shared with the inquiry a vast amount of paperwork and regulations pertaining to day-to-day operations. These range from guidelines concerning temporary confinement, induction processes, e-wing policy, to documents about preventing corruption and staff wrongdoing, safeguarding. There was a drug and alcohol policy and information about daily cleaning logs. You say there are also multiple Home Office orders and guidance, all of which are transposed into local processes. Presumably here you're referring exclusively to paper-based policies and guidance documents.
Yes, so it's G4S had all the paperwork in order, as far as I can judge. So they had policies in place in which they explicitly guided their officers to act in a certain way, but those policies don't seem to have prevented what happened. So that's the point I'm trying to make, and I think that raises questions about how those policies are communicated and how they are accepted and adopted by people actually doing the job.
Now, you say that at 6.10, all of this material demonstrates the Brook House had processes in place that should have prevented the kinds of behaviour evident on BBC Panorama. Forgive me. However, it's unclear how such documentation is communicated to staff and monitored. The sheer length of some of the documents suggests that there may have been little expectation of them being read by anyone other than their author. So what's the point of them?
Well, I think that's a good question. You do, obviously, any institution has to have governing documents to govern them and documents to set out the policies. But I think what is the next crucial step is trying to find a way of communicating those documents to all parties so that people can not just understand them, but also, contribute to them, feed into them, believe in them. And I think there's a role there, obviously a very key role there for officers. There's also potentially a role there for the detained population to be made aware of what the policies are so that they can know about them too.
So what are the new ways, do you think? What would you advise?
Well, I think I set out some suggestions in my supplementary report where I suggest that, I pay more attention there to trying to communicate some of these guidance documents to the detained population, but so that the detained population can know what their rights are, but also what the sort of local policy is around, for instance, drug and alcohol policy, because, they probably don't know what it is, and if they were told, then maybe they would try and avail themselves of some assistance if indeed they had a drug or alcohol problem. So I think there's a way in which these kinds of long technical policies need to be translated into documents and also, I guess, training and discussion that regular, everyday people can understand.
I mean, if you have a very lengthy policy document, would reducing it into sound bites which people could understand, those, in other words, who have to apply them at the coalface, would that help, do you think?
I think it could help. I mean, I think it would certainly be better than having a list of documents that nobody is paying any attention to, and I mean, I think this also speaks a bit to the distinction between the SMT level of staff and then the DCO level of staff, because for the SMTs, this is what they do. You know, they have to make all of these policies, and it's right that they make them, but unless they are somehow translated into the people who are, you know, on the shop floor, as people often refer to their job, then they're not really doing.
Well, it's just paper then, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah. Let me move on to the role of external agencies, and I'm asked to ask you some questions on behalf. I'm not interested in that. I'm asked to ask you some questions on behalf of the IMB, if I may. If you can go back to your first report at 10.9, please. You say there that the Brook House IMB committee was made up of 9 members, one of whom would visit Brook House at least once a week. You say that in the year 2016-17, the chair, Mrs. Colbrand, had been in post since 2006. And then you go on to say, in their reports, IMB members record that they walked around the facility and checked for complaints forms. They talked to officers and to people who were detained while monitoring the general state of cleanliness. And it's this, I think, which the IMB ask you to reconsider. IMB members sat on a variety of centre committees and held regular meetings with members of the SMT. Do you now accept, having reviewed that paragraph of that sentence, that IMB members had an open invitation to attend non-IMB meetings and committees to observe, but they didn't sit on those committees?
Yes.
And at 10.11, over the page on 46, there were some issues in Brook House that clearly concerned the IMB. Yeah, you say on the week commencing the 19th of June 2017, for example, Miss Mary Molyneux noted the uncomfortable heat on the housing units. Nearly 1 month later, on the 17th of July, Dick Webber wrote up concerns about a lack of cleanliness and disorder. So did you accept, when you look at those sorts of things, that the IMB noted and raised with G4S Management and Home Office a wider range of issues than those identified within just that paragraph? In other words, their remit was much wider than...
Yes, no, I do. I mean, and I apologise for making it seeming as though that it wasn't. I was trying to synthesise a huge amount of material, but yes.
Now, I'm going to take this reasonably shortly, and I hope I can be forgiven for doing so. At 10.12, you deal with some of the documents submitted by IMB members, which include criticism of the detained men. And so you give, by way of example, something Dick Webber wrote on the 8th of May 2017, when he reported that he was approached by someone for help who didn't impress me as being in the least reasonable in his approach. But he said there is some reason for disquiet over the nature and timing of the response he received. And you say the form doesn't make clear whether Mr. Webber recorded a complaint or pursued the man's case. Now, the IMB has referred you, and I think you've probably looked at a series of documents. I'm not going to go through them. But are you prepared to accept that whatever reservations Mr. Webber may have had about the individual, are you satisfied he and the IMB did in fact record and pursue that man's complaint?
Yes, I am. I suppose I would say two things, though. Because I was being asked to look at staff culture,
Yeah.
I was surprised to see a sort of formal record of that kind of view about a detained person in the records produced by the monitoring body. That concerned me. And then, although yes, when I when I went to look at the logbook, it was clear that he had indeed, Mr. Webber had done a series of things to pursue this man's case. There was a sort of wider issue around the record keeping, and so the logbook, that particular logbook in question, was all handwritten, and so there would have been no way to sort of cross-check particularly easily. And I think, in terms of their role as a monitoring body, I think that those two issues were actually quite important.
Now, the other issue I'm going to take pretty shortly is in the next paragraph at 10:13, where you refer to some of the writings in various IMB reports. So you refer to Miss Markwick describing a man who had a hissy fit certain months earlier. In a report for the week of April the 24th, she referred to a detained man on E-wing as a miscreant, a group of men on B-wing as, quote, demanding, unquote, while on the week commencing the 8th of August, she described a cleaner as, quote, very lazy, end quote. And the IMB, because you will have seen this, as it were, take you to task on singling out certain words as, because they are in quote marks, as having a particular significance. In particular also, you referred to Miss Molyneux's words in another document where she put quote marks around the word protest, which you felt dismissed the man's claims when Miss Molyneux had written up that they were protesting about food. I'm globalising it because we haven't got the time to go through all of these things individually, and in the end, how much they matter, I don't really know. But what do you say about all of that?
So I accept that with Mary Molyneux's, I went back and I reread it, and it was clear to me that she was in fact quoting somebody.
Sorry, which one are you?
The last one, that
protesting
where I
about
said
food.
that this was apparently something somebody had told her.
Yeah.
I think, again, I mean, and so I was wrong in that case. But I think, again, there was a sort of general question around record keeping, because there were other records where people used quotation marks, and they did not seem to be quotations. They seemed to be emphasising the word. So that was, that was the explanation for why I misunderstood Mary Molyneux. The other examples, I don't think, I think they are of concern for a monitoring body to be using those sorts of pejorative, judgmental terms about the detained population, and the describing the cleaner as very lazy. That would seem to me to be, and I know the rest of the sentence was about how he spent most of the day in his cell, in his bedroom, but actually I think that interpretation of him as very lazy overlooks other possible interpretations, which I would have thought the IMB would have known about, which was, maybe he was afraid of coming out of his cell, maybe he was depressed, maybe he had PTSD, maybe he wasn't sleeping well at night. Like, there's a whole series of reasons why people keep odd hours in a detention centre environment, and so to attribute it to laziness, I think, does reflect something of concern.
You will be alive to the fact that in Verita interview reports, and let's put one up on screen, VER 000229 at page 11, please. Tab 23 of the main volumes for you, Chair.
Thank you.
If you look at 144, this is a joint interview with Dick Webber and Mrs. Colbran, where at the if you look about 4 lines up from the bottom of 144, it's just the first 2 words are "we are monitors." Do you see?
Yeah.
It starts about 4 lines up.
Yeah.
We are monitors, really, rather than the resolvers of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Do you accept that's right as far as the IMB is concerned? They're just monitors, or is that oversimplistic?
I think it is oversimplifying. I mean, of course they are monitors, that's their role, but the point of a national preventive mechanism like the IMB is to monitor in order to prevent. And so I think that I feel like this is it slightly misrepresents, or maybe doesn't misrepresent. I feel like it's a slightly strange way of representing what they do, that they're simply there to watch but not actually to try and change anything. Seems to me an odd way of describing the actions of a national preventive mechanism.
And if we look at another joint interview, this time of Mr. Jones and Miss Molyneux, VER 000237, page 8. Paragraph 107. And it must be the next page. It says, Mr. Jones at 107, we're not trying to manage the place.
Mm-hmm.
We can make observations about the strengths of certain individuals or whatever and say who is good, bad and indifferent. But that's beyond our remit as well. Likewise, how the Home Office is dealing with the detainees and certain of the immigration issues. In fairness, the Home Office, when you go to them and say Joe Bloggs is hacked off because of this, they won't say to us, you're overstepping the mark, that's beyond your remit. They'll talk to us. Going back to use of force, I think the impact on detainees is fundamental. Do you agree? Obviously, they're not there to manage the place, but do you have any other observations about what Mr. Jones had to say?
I mean, no, they're not there to manage the place, but they are there to hold the place accountable and to safeguard the human rights of the people who are detained. And so I feel like they actually have an active responsibility and a lot of... They have a sort of access to what's going on that nobody else does, actually.
At 10.32 on page 51 of your first report, you reference the IMB committee report published in 2018 about the period 2017, in which they said they were horrified the completely unacceptable behaviour of the small group of staff shown in the footage. We've never witnessed instances of ill treatment of this kind, nor have we had any indications that it might be happening. If we had, we feel confident that we would have taken our concerns immediately to the top management of G4S and the Home Office at the centre. And your comment at 10.33 is, while the sentiment of this statement is welcome and important, it doesn't address the lingering questions about why and how the committee were unaware of the issues occurring in the centre they visited so regularly. And pausing there, do you have any thoughts about how and why it was they were ignorant?
So, I mean, I think if they're not witnessing it, you know, so if officers aren't doing and saying these things right in front of them, which I would imagine that officers wouldn't, then the only way in which they would be aware of it would be either through conversations, informal conversations with officers, and or conversations with detained people, or if detained people put in complaints. And I think that my understanding of the role of the IMB is that they, at least at this period, didn't take a view on and have a sort of formal way of talking to staff. So staff were outside their monitoring role, which I think is something that should change if it hasn't already. And I think there is some evidence, and I feel like somebody mentioned it in their evidence, that that detained people are not always aware of the IMB. And they don't, and I mean, they may not literally know who they are, but they also may not understand what their role is. And that it's a little bit of a similar example. It's a little bit like the sort of way in which G4S has all those policies in paper, but they don't necessarily translate into practice. And so I feel as though, given that the IMB are physically in the building and walk around, then and speak to people, then I think it is curious and concerning that they just didn't know about it, and it maybe speaks to something that which I think they are addressing much more in terms of how they interact with the detained population.
You continue to say, unfortunately, the documents submitted to the inquiry do point to a shared culture with officers among the committee at the time. The lack of trust of the detained men, the concerns about the work of GDWG, and the use of prison terminology all paint an organisation that was not fully independent and thus was not performing adequately as a safeguard for human rights. What did you mean by the shared culture?
Well, there I am talking about the kinds of words that I cited before from some of their reports, that there were, I thought, more examples than I was expecting where the detained population were cast as being difficult, miscreants. All of those sorts of terminology didn't seem to me to be what I would expect a human rights monitoring organisation to be how I thought they would see people who are detained. And I think also, again, this effect of prisonisation, it is evident.
I mean, you say at your 10.18 that some members of both the IMB and HMIP for Brook House were from prison backgrounds. Is that a problem for you?
I think it's part of the same set of issues that I've been discussing, which is, I think it runs a risk that it kind of shapes people's view of the detained population. If they themselves have come out of the prison service, or that they've previously monitored prisons, then they're going to see these institutions as being like prisons, and they're not. So yeah, I think it is a problem.
I mean, you also note at 10.14 that two co-chairs of the IMB had previously worked in prisons, with one having been a former prison governor. And as we learned, when Mr. Petherick came to give evidence, he knew Dick Webber, who I think had been that governor.
Yeah.
Is that a problem for you?
I think that is a problem. I think that they were not sufficiently independent.
Yeah. I mean, even John Connolly, in one of his inquiry witness statements, by reference to the IMB, said that most of them were ex-prison officers. So the same point applies, presumably. I mean, if you look at your 10.14, where I've just pointed out what you say there about members of the IMB, you say they adopted prison jargon in some of the reporting. Gareth Jones, in a document dated the week commencing July 8, wrote that the men on the units were kicking off. You note that in her report, in the week commencing August the 14th of 2017, Miss Barkwick referred to bang up. You've noted about the co-chairs, Miss Colbrand and Mr. Webber. And you say while Mrs. Colbrand had headed the IMB at Highdown, which is a prison, Mr. Webber was a former prison governor. And then you add this. In an interview with Verita dated the 8th of December 2017, Mr. Webber said the sections of the population in Brook House were like the prisoners he had previously managed, mad and the bad. Was that appropriate?
No.
Because?
Because they're not, I mean, it's not really an appropriate way to talk about prisoners either, but these people in detention are not prisoners.
At 10.18, you say that unlike the IMB, HMIP had an arm's length approach to monitoring. And what was it that persuaded you that while IMB were too close, HMIP were not?
By that I simply meant the different ways in which they fulfil their roles as part of the UK National Preventive Mechanism. So the IMB are resident in any one side of custody, whereas HMIP do these periodic visits. That's all I meant by arm's length.
Yeah. Do you think there were any fundamental misplaced limitations on the role of the IMB? They weren't there to manage the place, as we saw Mr. Jones, I think it was, say to Verita. What did you understand the limitation of the role was? Was it to make sure that the human rights of detainees were protected, or was it limited to the fabric of the place?
So as part of the UK National Preventive Mechanism, their roles and duties are set out under OPCAT, and they are there to safeguard human rights. So, and I mean, insofar as the fabric of the building has a role to play in that, if you're holding people in dirty and dangerous conditions, that's obviously part of
it.
But no, their role is not purely limited to is it hot or is it cold or is it dirty?
Yeah, so that it's not limited to a room is too hot, to the cleanliness of the wings or particular rooms. It goes much further than that. Do you think they were adequately equipped, HMIB, whether they are or are not now is perhaps neither here nor there, but at the time were IMB equipped to identify or address issues of vulnerability and detainee safeguards?
The IMB?
At the time? I think I said H, I meant I. Yeah.
I mean, they weren't, I don't know whether members of staff had medical training, so to that extent, you could argue that they weren't adequately equipped. But, I mean, I suppose it seems to me that if you go in regularly and you see a highly distressed population, then it's not beyond their ability to understand that the people are vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they did.
Let's look at some aspects around the Home Office, its oversight and monitoring. Can we go to your second report? At 6.15, page 27, please. You say that, by reference to section 4 of this report, that the location of Home Office staff may have made it more difficult for them to gauge what was happening more widely in Brook House, for example, on the housing units. And located in offices in the administrative corridor, Home Office staff would have had few occasions to interact informally or otherwise with DCOs or DCMs. And at 6.16, they would have had more interaction with the detained population, however, as they meet regularly with individuals to update them on details about their immigration case. In those interactions, there should have been occasion to learn about concerns from the detained men about their treatment in Brook House. Pausing there, have you fathomed why in those interactions they appear not to have learned anything?
Well, I think this goes back to the division of labour between the Home Office and the custodial staff, so that really those interactions that the Home Office staff have in Brook House or in any IRC are purely around the immigration case. So they're basically moments where they pass documents backwards and forwards to the detained person and give them updates or ask for further information. And my understanding of those interactions is that they do not concern themselves with the experience of detention. And that would be somewhere where changes could be made, actually.
I suppose one could argue there was nothing stopping a detained man telling a Home Office official during one of those meetings that he'd been assaulted the previous day.
No, there's nothing stopping them other than the high anxiety they're likely to be feeling in that particular meeting, because of course the Home Office person is giving them information about their immigration case. And in my research, I've always found that the detained population are very confused often about the distinction between custody staff and Home Office staff. They don't really see them as different. And of course, given that the custodial staff, that the company is, working for the Home Office, they're right on some level to not necessarily differentiate between them. Yeah. So, and then the other issue would be that actually the interest of the detained person in that meeting is also on their immigration case. So I think there's a lot of factors which would make it difficult for somebody to just tell the Home Office member of staff without being prompted.
Mm. I mean, do you think, from everything you've seen, that whether or not they weren't told, the Home Office ought to have known, or ought to have been alive to the fact that what was going on at Brook House, in terms of abuse of detained men?
Well, I think they ought to have known because they're the authority, and Brook House was being run on their behalf, so they ought to have known in a kind of moral sense and in a legal sense. They also ought to have known because although they are located on the administrative corridor, you would have thought that they would have seen some detention officers and they would have had some interactions with them. So.
Can we think now about contractual priorities? I mean, in the second report at 7.9, you are asked about the contract, and you say, in regards to the second question about the efficacy of contract delivery, it's somewhat difficult to come to a firm conclusion because of the manner in which the contract depended on self-reporting by G4S. However, you say the events of 2017, caught on film by Mr. Tully, suggest that, at a bare minimum, aspects of the contract concerning safety and the treatment of vulnerable people were not adequately delivered. And then we have Nathan Ward's account, if perhaps we can put that up, please. Chair, it's supplementary bundle tab 9, DL000141 at page 34. Paragraph 100, where he talks about penalty points and fines contained in the contract. I was always very struck by the system devised for penalising breaches of the contract and the perversity of the priorities it set, and then he sets out some of the detail of that. And then on the next page, 102, another point that I think is significant is that the penalty points in Schedule G fixed a fine of £30,000 for an escape versus £10,000 if a detainee died. This just shows the relative worth of welfare over security and how little the lives of the detainees were valued against the imperatives of removal, and how the incentives / profit costs were weighted against protecting life and welfare. 103, this raises clear questions about the priorities and suitability of these contractual arrangements and the ability of the laid-down procedures to ensure safety and welfare of detainees. The contract as a whole makes clear the Home Office's own priorities, the message it sends to the IRCs about those priorities, as well as the limited consequences for serious failings and conduct for failures to protect detainees. Now, the contract with Serco is different, but we're not focusing on that contract. We're focusing on this one. Do you agree with what he says, that the contract had its priorities all wrong?
Yes, I mean, the contract is very, very long, and I have read it, but I'm not a contract lawyer. But I mean, certainly when you see the financial arrangements, just these ones that are on the screen at the moment, they would charge them, the penalty was higher for an escape than for a death. That does suggest that the priorities were around security, not around welfare.
You talk about, and you've already mentioned this, that detention should be more rights-focused. And by that you mean, describe to us what you really are saying to us.
Well, I mean two things. I mean actual access to sort of legal rights and protections, and that detained population should have much better access, much clearer access, and staff should as well. But I also mean something more discursive, that the detained population should really be understood as people who have rights simply because they are humans, like the people who are locking them up and looking after them. And so it would have, practical things like having regular legal aid clinics in detention centres, which there used to be more of, and then they've sort of disappeared as it cuts to legal aid. but also a kind of other way of discussing detained people that's not simply talking about them as security risks.
What other ways do you think detainees could assert or exercise their legal rights in a way which they can't at the moment?
Well, I think that very few of them have access to proper legal counsel of any sort. And I mean, the centres do, have lists of law firms that they can, and solicitors that they can contact, but that's enormously difficult. There are organisations, I mean, at Gatwick, at Brook House, we saw the Gatwick Welfare Detainee Group did a lot of work with them initially, trying to sort of signpost and help them understand what some of their options were, but that seems to have been quite contested and was eventually shut down, as I understand it.
What about the problems of language and the problems of vulnerability, mental ill health?
Yes,
how do those people assert their rights when they're in administrative detention indefinitely?
Well, so it's enormously difficult, but that's another reason why the state and the private sector companies really are under an obligation to ensure that there's parity of treatment and experience across those dimensions. And I mean, I think with the mental ill health, that raises very urgent questions about whether people would be able to even understand what their rights could be, and let alone avail themselves. The language one is potentially easy to solve with the use of interpreters, but all of this would require a fairly significant change to the view of what the role and responsibility is of both the Home Office and the private contractors running the centres.
It's not peculiar to Brook House, it's general.
I think it's general.
General application. Finally, this, before I come to asking you about the key issues here in your recommendations. I'm asked on behalf of the detained persons core participants to ask you about the companies which run these private contracts. So are there characteristics pertaining to a company or a corporate group which increases the chances of this kind of thing recurring, or which might militate against it? I mean, what's your ideal company running this kind of show?
I don't. So it's an interesting question, and I'm actually not sure that there is a distinction between the companies. So and the evidence that I have for this is actually this detainee survey that I usually administer when we're not in a pandemic, which I've done across all of the different detention centres. And for example, we administered at Tinsley House and at Brook House. Same company, same SMT, completely different responses. And I think what that shows is that there are actual differences between establishments which don't necessarily map onto the company. There is, and that makes some amount of sense, because one of the things that happens in a contracted system like IRCs is that when the contract changes hands, only the people at the top normally move on. The DCO staff complement will stay there. So, and people, when you talk to staff, they often feel quite attached to the institution that they work for. They work in. They don't normally feel that attached to the company they work for. So I don't really think it's possible to differentiate between the companies.
So there's nothing you can help us with about that. Ultimately, I suppose a company is only as good as the contract it has as well. Would that be a fair comment?
Yes. So I mean, I think one of the immense challenges of it being a contracted out system is that there is no transparency around the contract. The contracts are not shared because of corporate confidentiality, and I think that is a problem, and I think that it's also a failure of imagination. I think contracts could be made more accessible. You could just take out the money bit, but you could still show what what they're promising to deliver. And it does seem to have been a problem at Brook House at the time that it relied very strongly on self-reporting by G4S, and that also there were just so many items that needed to be measured and reported, so that they hadn't kind of got much focus.
Okay. Thank you. Chair, it's a little early perhaps, but can I suggest now, before I go on to Professor Bosworth's key issues and her suggestions going forward. A break of 15 minutes. It's 10 past by my watch, so 25 past.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A few general questions, Professor Bosworth, under the general heading Key Issues and Recommendations. The detained persons core participants asked me to ask you this, whether you agree that whilst changes to the policies, processes or training may help improve the immediate situation at Brook House, they can't correct the systemic deficits and culture which gave rise to the risk of abuse. It's a rather negative approach, but I mean, what they're really saying is changes to policies, processes or training are all well and good, but they can't correct the sort of systemic deficits and the cultural problems which gave rise to the risk of abuse or the actual abuse in this instance. Do you think that's unduly pessimistic, or is it accurate?
I think it could be both at the same time. I mean, I think there is an issue here that the fact that we have this other report from a different time in a different centre, the Oakington report, having a very similar set of recommendations, a very similar set of problems, and then recommendations that some of which are similar to the ones I've made. And yet then we have, it sort of repeats itself in Brook House. I think that is a challenge to imagining the efficacy of changing policies and processes. So, yes.
Yes and no, or just yes?
Well, I mean, I think changing policies and practices has a role to play because, you know, as you've said previously, in a world in which there are still places like Brook House, then I think there's work to be done on how those places are run. Yeah. But will addressing those things completely transform them? No, I don't think so.
I mean, if changes are made to policies, in particular, and processes which are written up in guidance, then what you told us earlier about communication becomes more key, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. The second question I'm asked to ask you in this regard is this. Do you agree that AAR safeguards need to be strengthened to ensure that vulnerable persons are not being detained in the first place?
Yes.
Okay. Right. In your first report, your original report, you characterised your conclusions and suggestions, as you put them, as preliminary. Preliminary presumably on the basis that you might see more evidence which would change those conclusions and suggestions. Has anything changed your mind about any of the conclusions and suggestions you expressed in that first report?
No.
And the way that you structured the first report is in each of the various sections, it was followed by a conclusions and suggestions series of paragraphs. Is that right?
Yes.
I'm not going to go through them all. Likewise, in your second report, which you structured slightly differently, I think you have an overarching conclusion section at the end. You've considered the key issues and what your recommendations are, as I've slightly translated them into recommendations rather than suggestions, but it may amount to the same thing. But first of all, let me ask you this. Do you think it's possible to get right the balance between care, trust and security in an establishment built like Brook House, in other words, built as a Category B prison, designed to hold people for the purpose of their removal? Can that balance be properly struck?
I suppose I don't really think it can be properly struck. I think it's very, very hard to expect staff to care for vulnerable people in detention, or even for people who are not vulnerable in detention, in an institution that is built and run like Brook House.
The second thing I'd like to ask you is this. Whereas academic work on prisons emphasises the importance of relationships between staff and prisoners, you've talked about some of that today, in creating decent establishments. Is it at all clear to you how equivalent ties can be forged in an establishment designed to facilitate removal, in other words, not to rehabilitate or to reintegrate, and between two groups who differ in terms of language, culture and race and ethnicity?
Well, I think it's enormously challenging, and I think that that is very, very hard, particularly in a place like Brook House, which is designed with such high security measures in place. I suppose I think it is worth remarking that in Tinsley House, which is next door, and which is not built to the same security standards, that there is, that there was a sort of better regime and better relationships between staff and the detained population. But I think it is very challenging to do that in an institution that's designed to expel people, or facilitate their removal, rather.
I think you've thought about, my request, matters in general which complicate the overall picture. Can you tell us what they are? Matters which complicate. I mean, you start with the vulnerability of the population.
Yeah. So I mean, if the idea is that in order to get the balance between care and security right, we need to imagine an institution where there can be meaningful human relationships between staff and the detained population. I think that that is very difficult in an environment where there is still being people who have these pre-existing vulnerabilities. I think it's very difficult, who are held there in those institutions. I think it's very difficult in an institution where we have evidence that actually the indefinite nature of the detention creates vulnerabilities and worsens people's mental health. I think that's a massive problem. And then I think there are, this question around communication, that's another fairly straightforward barrier. I think that the crux of the problem is the purpose of the places. And I think it's quite hard to expect officers to build relationship with people who've been earmarked as people who we don't want to have relationships with because we want them to leave the country. I think that there's a kind of dissonance in that demand that we're making of staff, which for officers is very hard to reconcile. And some of them do, but I think it's very difficult.
I think you probably include as matters which complicate the picture something you mentioned already, the low pay and the training of staff, or the minimal training of staff, shift work. Does the hierarchy among officers complicate the picture?
Yes, so I mean this is a difficult, challenging job which is designed to be performed by people who are paid poorly and who are asked to do very long shifts and who don't have much of an opportunity to imagine themselves in a different role within the establishment, because there is no clear career structure other than for the small handful who might move into the DCM role. And I think all of that, again, it stops it being a kind of aspirational career path because it's actually not a very good job.
I asked you to consider, Professor, you'll remember, a number of issues which you wrote down as a sort of a memoir to yourself. Let me ask you this, and please list for us what you noted. The question is, during the relevant period, does the evidence suggest that Brook House had fundamental problems with some specific practical issues, and if so, what did they include? And can you just tell us, please, from your list of what you saw as the fundamental problems? So, I mean,
there was a fundamental problem around the presence of spice that was smuggled into the centre, and that was a factor that was apparent in other sites of custody at the time. So prisons in England and Wales had a big problem with spice at the time, but this is a new problem in detention centres, and it was obviously there was just a significant lapse in security. I think.
Next.
I think that there was also, it seems clear to me that there was an insufficient number of custodial staff. So the evidence, people talk about that a lot across all of the different people who've provided evidence, and that the insufficient number of staff had a knock-on effect on the provision of regimes, meaning that there just simply wasn't enough to do for the detained population, that they couldn't access the sorts of things the centre's meant to provide, and it also had an impact on staff stress levels and staff well-being, because they were under an enormous amount of pressure. There were key aspects of safeguarding within the adults at risk policy which did not seem to be working well, and there were questions about how much of the adults at risk policy had actually been sort of understood and absorbed by the institution in the relevant period. Dr. Hart and other people have pointed out that the Rule 35 process didn't work effectively. And then there are the things we've already been discussing today a lot, the design of the building, the way in which the detained population don't have access to fresh air unless they go out into the concrete courtyards, which are then extremely noisy because of the planes, and the way in which it was managed like a prison. So there were sort of regular roll counts and lockups, which, in an administrative side of detention, it seemed to me to be wholly unnecessary, because those are the practices which are devised for a prison, not a detention centre. I identified some criticisms that I made around some of the oversight bodies not being sufficiently independent from G4S, and therefore not picking up on the sorts of problems that were captured on the film.
You included in that, I think, the IMB, but also the Home Office Contract Monitor.
And so the IMB and the Home Office Contract Monitor.
Yeah.
That the detained population did not seem to be able to always receive the help that they needed, either in quite sort of basic requests within Brook House. So there's footage showing men coming in asking for toilet roll or something, and not being given that and being told to wait, or in terms of of information about their immigration case, and these are practical problems. There's a lot of criticism, and it seems evident, about a lack of visibility and seemingly also a lack of engagement by senior managers. So the sort of physical location of the managers away from where the action was, where the actual DCOs were working. And then there's a lot of evidence of poor communication among staff, not just in terms of policy, but actually interpersonally poor communication, which had led to grievances.
A long-established grievance culture is what we've been told.
Yes.
Yeah. So, in combination, was it your view that the result of all of those factors contributed to low staff morale?
Yes.
And poorly developed or implemented mechanisms for dealing with the stresses of work?
Yes.
And were they further compounded by a failure to act on racist and sexist language and attitudes and behaviours?
Yes.
What would it take to implement a decency agenda in a place like Brook House?
So some of the things that I suggest in my reports, and that I think could be considered, would start with the issue of transparency. So a greater emphasis on transparency about the governance of the institutions. So the governance of Brook House, which would include, for example, posting information on the housing units about the kinds of concerns and complaints that the detained population were making, and that maybe even that the staff were making, and documentation of how those concerns and complaints had been handled. I also think that there should be and could be more integration of the detained population into decision making about the regime and other needs, because it's the people who are in the centre who will best know what they need. And there are, of course, detainee reps on committees, and that those things do exist, but they probably need a little bit more investment and thought, I think, to really try and integrate the detained population.
Yeah, pausing there, do they help at all? Because detainee reps may not be there over long, and so presumably a detainee rep on a committee 1 week is replaced by somebody entirely different in another. So is there any continuity?
So I think that's undoubtedly a challenge for IRCs. I mean, it is also the case that all IRCs in Brook House wouldn't be any different in this. We'll have some people who are there for quite some time, so not everybody's in and out within a week. But I mean, it is difficult to engage the detained population because their attention is on their immigration case, not on their experience of custody.
So finally, what I'm going to ask you to do, please, because as I've already made clear, I've asked you to consider and note for yourself, for the purposes of your evidence, what your recommendations are going to be. And you've listed 11, letters A to K. What I'm going to ask you to do to help everybody's note, and particularly the chair, for the purposes of her report, is to simply read out A through to K what your recommendations are, please.
Okay.
And you may probably wish to add one further one, but just list the ones that you've told us about, please.
Okay.
I'll remind you of which it is.
Okay. So I've already said the first two, but I'll read them out again.
Just read them out as you've written them
Okay.
out.
A greater emphasis on transparency in the governance of these institutions, including posting information on housing units about regular concerns and complaints raised by the detained men and staff and how they've been handled.
So that's your first.
That's
A. B.
B is more integration of the detained population into decision-making about the detention regime and other needs.
Thank you. Next, C.
C, developing informal and formal mechanisms for staff to offload concerns and frustrations, mentoring is what I mean, as well as formal and informal mechanisms of staff oversight to address, for example, poor language, and formal and informal mechanisms of praise and reward to acknowledge good work.
Yeah. Next, please.
D, revisiting staff training materials and their delivery to rebalance the content on security, care and rights. E, better instruction of staff in the language and content of rights. It's very minimal in training, and I suggest that this part of the training could be delivered by HMIP, IMB or by a legal aid charity. F, more information for the detained population too about their legal rights and better access to legal advice. G, improved visibility and communication with senior staff and Home Office staff for the detained population and the officers. H, a clearer and more developed career pathway to close the gap between DCOs and more senior colleagues. I, more varied and more regular additional training to professionalise the DCO role. J, more attention to misogyny as well as to racism to stamp it out. And K, inclusion of a wider range of stakeholders, including advocacy groups, to make the institution more transparent.
And I think, although you appreciate it's not an issue in the end that the chair can deal with, far less a recommendation she can make, but it's something that you've emphasised more than once, is the indefinite nature of detention, which is, for you, a fundamental issue.
Yes, so, I mean, I would recommend, and I have in other circumstances too, that the UK should bring in a time limit to immigration detention.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Bosworth. That's all I'm going to ask you. I dare say the chair will have a few questions for you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Altman. Thank you, Professor Bosworth. I do have a couple of questions. I'll just try and ask them in a logical order. I'm interested in you. We've talked, and you cover in both of your reports, and obviously Mr. Altman's asked you to a degree as well today about oversight mechanisms, and I'm thinking primarily of IMB and HMIP here. Those mechanisms themselves are developed from the prison world, and you've talked about some of the specific issues that you have a view about as to how they operated in this context, and perhaps some criticisms of that. Do you have a view on whether structurally of themselves there are issues because they were designed for a prison environment and an IRC is not a prison?
No, because I don't think structurally of themselves that's a problem. I mean, I think that detention centres are not prisons, but they are sites of custody, and national preventive mechanisms are meant to visit all sites of custody. So I think that the logic of having monitoring groups who are there to try and in a way, be the eyes and ears of the rest of us in these sites that we can't access. I think that logic makes sense in a detention centre and a detention setting. I think the thing that could be done differently would be to, and I say this in one of the reports, would be to think again about integrating other organisations, because one of the things that IRCs have, which is different to prisons, is that they all have a visitor group. So that's actually set up in their design. And it seems to me that there's a, I think, rather unhelpful distinction made between monitoring bodies and advocacy groups, because the advocacy groups, like in the Brook House situation, the Gatwick Welfare Detainee Group, they will have a slightly different kind of relationship with the detained population, and they might be sought out by some people who don't seek out IMB. And so in a way, if they could be brought into the conversation more, rather than seen as somehow separate because they're not a monitoring group, they're an advocacy group, I actually think that could be quite important.
Thank you. We've heard some evidence from formerly detained people about their perhaps them not understanding necessarily what they could expect. They weren't sure about making complaints, and they've told us about mistreatment, but that they weren't sure whether or not is this just the way it is. Just hearing your list of some of the things that you kind of are recommending, does that speak to some of the issues that you've identified, that kind of lack of awareness of what their rights may be, and therefore not kind of able to access
Yes.
a way to challenge it if they fear that they're not having those rights in the way that they should?
Yes, no, I think that is the case. And I think, again, it's a little, I think there's lots of reasons for their uncertainty. And, sometimes it might be about if they come from places where they, have experienced brutality from a figure of authority before. And we know some people in detention have, and particularly some of the people who've given evidence to this inquiry. So that, they may, in a way, almost think that that's what happens. But I think it is also a little bit about this uneasy connection between a custodial experience that is for the purpose of an immigration issue, because their real problem is their immigration issue, and that is always going to be the thing which they're most concerned about. And so I suspect it might lend itself to it might make it harder for them to actually really pay attention to and try and change their custodial experience, because they're, at least in my research, they're always worried about what could happen if they complain. Will it have a bearing on their immigration case? Because this relationship between the Home Office and the private sector, there is not clear, and indeed all of the parties who come in and out of detention, is not clear. I think it's not clear enough to the detained population. So there's a job there to do to try and make sure that they really know much more concretely what their rights are and who all these different people are, and what they can and should expect. And the companies, G4S would have had an induction program, and they would have told them things. So it's not like there's no attempt made. There is an attempt made, but I think there's a lack of understanding about how confused and confusing these sites really are for the people who are locked up in them.
Thank you. We heard evidence from a member of staff who told us that it's not possible to teach coping mechanisms. We've also heard from lots of members of staff an explanation that some of the use of bad language was part of those, was a coping mechanism, it was a reaction to stress. Do you have any observations about that? I'm interested what you said about the training that the prison service are undertaking on the secondary trauma.
Yeah. Yes. So one of the statements that the staff made that I found the most striking, and I think it was Mr. Pascali, said something along the lines of, "I've never held a professional. I have no qualifications. I've never held a professional job," or he said something along those lines, which struck me as being quite a remarkable way of referring to his own experience as a worker, because it sort of casts this work as not being professional somehow. Whereas, of course, it is. I mean, it's a profession, and it has a huge amount of responsibility for the well-being of other people. And so I think that there is. I think that whereas I understand people saying that these are coping mechanisms, and there's obviously an element of truth in that, I also think that you know, when I'm really, really stressed, I don't reach for swearing and racist language. And so there's a certain way in which that is also a little bit of an excuse, and to explain it as just being about a coping mechanism. And so I think there's sort of two things that need to happen. One is to take it seriously and to think about secondary trauma, and there are you know, things already being done in other areas, not just the prison service, obviously also in healthcare. And then the other part of that would be to think about professionalising it, to think about it as an actual career, not just something you sort of fall into because you live near the airport and it's the best you could do. And those, you know, they're both quite practical responses that change could happen in, I think.
Thank you. Then my final question. We also heard from some former members of staff about the lack of focus on just how to talk to people in the training. And I'm interested in some of what you told us about the kind of feminisation of some of the tasks. And is there a connection between that in your mind? The skill of talking to people and the importance put on that or not put on it?
So one of the things that detention officers quite often talk about is that they talk about the importance of interpersonal skills. So this is a kind of terminology that appears in the training, and it's one of the claims that sometimes officers make about that's what characterises their jobs, that you have to have good interpersonal skills. The difficulty is that they often are having to talk with people who either they don't have a common language, so I'm not quite sure how your interpersonal skills work under those circumstances, or at least in the relevant period where the people were highly vulnerable and or were having drug crises. And so I think that side of the job is objectively really difficult. And I think you're right in what you're talking about gender, that you know, in our society, we would normally think of people who talk and listen to feelings and invite people to share their concerns. It is a sort of feminized way of interacting with people, and men probably are not really taught to do that as much, and they're not taught to value those kinds of ways of interacting. So how you can encourage officers to take the time and to do that, particularly when they have all these other duties that they're meant to do all the time, like checking people off lists and doing roll count and locking them and unlocking them. I think that's a very demanding, it's very demanding for them.
Thank you very much. I have no other questions for you, and I'm very grateful for your time spending the whole day with us. Thank you very much, Professor Butterworth.
Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ortman. Thank you.
All right.